You've been around church much at all, you've likely heard this statement: God answers all prayers. Well, he does. And you've probably heard how it often continues. People will say, sometimes God's answer is yes, sometimes God's answer is no, and sometimes his answer is not yet. Now, I believe those are true, but I also believe there is more to it than that. And that's been hitting me as hard as anything as I continue to dig into Habakkuk for this new Sunday series. While I believe God does answer all prayers, sometimes I believe his answer is, do you trust me? If the answer is yes. Sometimes his answer is, do you trust me? If the answer is no. Sometimes his answer is, do you trust me? If the answer is not yet. But at the heart of it, the answer he always gives is another question. Do you trust me? And not just in general terms. Do you trust me with what you ask me for, no matter what the rest of the answer is? Now, I see that as much as anything where we are in Habakkuk. And as we get into it, let's quickly review what he put to God so openly and honestly. We looked at it last week, and this is a sampling of Bible versions of it. Lord, I continue to ask for help. How long will you ignore me? How long must I beg for your help before you listen? Why do you allow violence and lawlessness and crime and cruelty to spread everywhere? I cried to you about the violence, but you did nothing. People are stealing things and hurting others, and they're arguing and they're fighting. And criminals crowd out honest people and twist the laws around. Evil people gain while good people lose. The judges no longer make fair decisions. Why do you make me look at these terrible things? Now, Habakkuk unloaded that on God 2,600 years ago, but it sounds like he could have been reading today's news. Habakkuk had been looking around his town and hearing about his nation and hearing about the rest of the civilized world as they knew it. And he was confused and he was frustrated, and it seems he was at least a little angry in general and with God. And today we're going to look at God's first reply to Habakkuk. The first thing I did notice was God did not turn Habakkuk into a pile of ashes with a lightning bolt for asking those kinds of questions those ways. No, look, the Lord replied, look around at the nations. Look and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you would not believe, even if someone told you about it. Now look at your own day and told you about it in there. In English, it can be hard to tell whether you or your is meant to be singular or plural. That is not the case in the original languages of the Bible. And even though Habakkuk was the one who got so brutally honest with God, God's reply was in the plural form. He included Habakkuk in his reply, but it was directed at all of the Israelites. Now, if God were to tell you, look around, be amazed, I am doing something you wouldn't believe. If you heard that from God and you knew it was from God, would you be excited or concerned? Or maybe even a little scared? See, many people pull a verse like that out of its context and twist it into a promise that you could put on an inspirational card or a coffee mug. It's like what many people do with something God said to the prophet Jeremiah. I know the plans I have for you. They are plans for good and not disaster, to give you a future and a hope. But most people miss the context, and especially the verse right before that, where God said his plans included 70 hard years for them in exile in Babylon. I mean, that means most of them died in exile. Many suffered, many were mistreated, and most were extremely overworked. God said all of that was part of his plans. It's like another Bible verse that's well known in many churches. Uh, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. Now, humble themselves in there was originally written in what's basically kind of like an ongoing passive tense. So it would have been more like be being humbled rather than, kind of gritting our spiritual teeth and trying to humble ourselves. Have you ever tried to do that? How did it go for you? Be being humbled. An Old Testament scholar and Hebrew scholar I appreciate says the word for humbled was used in wrestling. When a wrestler was ready to surrender in a match, he would tap his opponent on the back and say their equivalent of humbled. Be being humbled, says God. This should be a profoundly humbling time. What we're living through right now should be a profoundly humbling time in unique ways for people of this color. We should be trying to listen to learn about, and to learn from African Americans. And what we're hearing, what we're learning about, and what we're learning from them has to be profoundly humbling at multiple levels if we are to truly begin to be any kind of a part of genuine biblical help these days. Now, Second Chronicles 7:14 and Habakkuk 1:5 show how important it is to learn the context of Bible verses, to follow the flow of where they've come from and where they're headed, rather than pulling them out of their context and trying to make them say what we want them to say. For example, Second Chronicles 7:14 came after a 2-week long worship service to celebrate the completion of the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, it was such a massive worship celebration. It included the sacrifices of 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. In the aftermath of all of that, God appeared to Solomon and gave him the line about how his people are to be being humbled. Now, a lot of people know that verse, but they don't know the one right before it. God thanked Solomon for all the work on the temple and the massive worship service, but added a significant challenge. If I shut up the heavens so there is no rain, or if I command the locust swarms to eat up all of your crops, or catch this last one, if I send an epidemic among you. Wait. What? Could God do that? Would God do that? Wrestle with the answers to that. God said, if I were to do any of those things, or when I do any of those things, if my people who are called by my name will be being humbled and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. Whose wicked ways? His people's wicked ways, our wicked ways. We need to be being humbled. We often need to pray things like King David did. Search me thoroughly, O God, and show my heart. Test me and show my anxious thoughts. Go slowly over this next part. See if there is any wicked or hurtful way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now hold on to that. Carry it to where God told Habakkuk to look around at the nations, look and be amazed. For I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe, even if someone told you about it. Now, look at what God said would amaze and shock them. I'm raising up the Babylonians. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. Now, Babylon, at that point in history, was already becoming stronger and more violent than the other world powers combined. Yet here God said he was going to raise them even higher. I cannot think of anything that would have stunned Habakkuk more. After crying out to God about pain and violence and evil going on within Israel, God told him the amazing surprise he had for them was the Babylonians were about to begin sweeping over them like they had never seen. I mean, that would be like, say, ISIS or the Taliban growing like never before and sweeping across North America with God behind it. I hear the echo of that question I posed earlier from God. Do you trust me with this? If you have been around this faith in God thing for more than a couple of years, would you say genuine trust in God grows more in some of the hardest places on the planet and shrinks in places where life seems the easiest? If your answer is yes, slow down and think about that. And remember, being humbled. Could, quote unquote, hard times show God's hand in things as much as good times? Even if someone could learn to trust God perfectly and constantly, it would not keep hard things from happening. Not only that, not believing in God does not keep hard things from happening. Many people say they don't believe in God. And many of the people who say they don't believe in God react the most negatively against him when hard things happen, which is interesting if they don't believe in God. Either way, you cannot get around the reality that Jesus said here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, hard things, even very hard things. Now, the God Habakkuk was talking to is the only one who offers to be with us in the midst of hard things. And for some, that is an immeasurable comfort. Others ask why they would want to be with the one who caused the hard thing, or who could have stopped the hard thing from happening. Part of being open to being humbled includes admitting we don't know as much as God. And Habakkuk can teach us the fullness of God's promise to be with us, especially when our emotions are in chaos and we have hard questions about hard things. That's one of the reasons I call this series The Lost Rhythm of Lament. Now, some things that happen in the natural world are so hard, the only way we'll have any hope of getting through them or growing because of them is if there's something supernatural going on. When something hard is going on and God asks, "Do you trust me with this?" the only way we will be able to answer yes is if there is something supernatural going on and going on in us. That is, if the Holy Spirit is working in us. We're going to take several weeks to get there, but I believe that is the only way I can explain Habakkuk coming to the conclusion he did after this conversation with God about some of the hardest realities in life. Now, as I wrote that, a Bible verse began to grow louder in my mind, and I believe it is one of the most misunderstood and even misused verses in the Bible. It's Romans 8:28, which most English Bibles put in some form of all things work together for good. Now, we must be very careful to not twist what that verse was really saying. Although, as I dug into it, I was shocked by how many ways it does get twisted. First of all, Romans 8:28 is not saying all things are good. Some things are hard. Some things are very hard. Many people are experiencing those kinds of things right now, particularly African Americans. One version of Romans 8:28 says all things work together for my good. There are songs that repeat that in the chorus. But there is no form of anything like my in the original line. All things meant all things, not just things in my microscopic dot in the eternal story. Despite that, the word all is often made to look dangerously self centered, as in, all things that happen to me or around me will work together for my good or good that I will eventually see. I cannot say this strongly enough. Something hard in your life may work out well for you before your life ends. But Romans 8:28 does not promise that. The word for good in the verse meant more than what would just be considered good here and now. In context, and the way Paul used it gave it a sense of complete, absolutely, completely complete, and final good, as in how it will be when human history ends and all things that happened in human history will begin to be seen, will begin to be known and understood by those who will be with God in the next stage of eternity. That is ultimately what God had in mind when he pushed Paul to write about all things being worked together. I just barely have my baby toe in the stormy ocean, trying to understand the layers of racism and the impact of those layers. But I have learned, even just over the past few days, many African Americans have experiences with hard things and a longing for heaven that I cannot comprehend. Most African American Christians have a unique perspective of God's kingdom being here and still coming. Much of the history of that was captured in music. I'm just barely beginning to scratch the surface of African American history and its impact today. Uh, for example, I've been studying and listening to what are called the spirituals, especially because they represent a form of longing for heaven that I cannot know. And they allow for a rhythm of lament that I cannot comprehend. But again, with just my baby toe into it and just barely beginning to scratch the surface of it, I'm just starting to get an understanding of what those spirituals, so many of them, could mean.
Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. When Peter was preaching at Pentecost, I'm going to walk in Jerusalem just like John. His soul was filled with the Holy Ghost. I'm going to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. John said that Jerusalem was full square. I'm going to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I prayed to the Lord and he flew there. I'm going to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. Jacob's ladder must be long. I'm going to walk in Jerusalem just like John.
You see, the word for good in Romans 8:28 referred mostly to a kind of complete and final good, one we cannot fully know here between Eden and heaven. But our view of all things being worked together for good can still be so, I gotta say, dangerously biased. For example, our thoughts of, say, 3 million Israelites walking safely across the Red Sea can be abruptly interrupted when one part of our story gets hard and our trust is challenged. I mean, I believe and I trust the story of the Red Sea crossing. Oh, but it can be hard to carry that trust over to trusting God with, say, church finances. Now, bear with me for a little more grammar. The word that was originally in Romans 8:28 for all things was plural. but the verb for work was written in the singular form. That means this isn't about all things working together. That, to me, makes it sound kind of random and uncoordinated. It was more fully all things, all things are worked together. And a little later it adds, work together by God. All things are worked together by God. I mean, think of this. Depending on who you believe, Earth is somewhere between 6,000 and, I don't know, 4 billion years old. Regardless of its age, there are estimates of as many as 100 billion people who lived on Earth or are living on Earth, total number of humanoids. Romans 8:28 says all of that, all the details of each life, including each bird in each tree out in the courtyard here, all of that has been and is being worked together by God. We cannot even begin to imagine how many things that includes, how many things God is working together right now. Now, back to Habakkuk. He was experiencing extremely hard things. Where we are in his story, God had just told him things were going to get harder. God's subtle question, but God's enormous question, echoes through the centuries. Do you trust me with this? I don't know what your this is. I don't know what any of your thises have been. And I don't know what this is waiting, even tomorrow morning. But that question, do you trust me with this? I don't know what I can do other than pray. Now, Father, I know there are many who say yes to that. They trust you. And their trust is so deep and so real and so vibrant. Thank you for your grace for that, as delivered through the Holy Spirit. May those who find it easy to trust you grow more grateful and more humbled by that. I pray for those who find trusting you hard right now, maybe even out of the question. May the Holy Spirit breathe in them so that trust in you would grow in them, so that trust in you would grow in us, and that we would know more about the grace that makes us, lets us, welcomes us, invites us to trust. Again and again and again, we keep coming back to your